decided to Google hostility in America today, and what I found was kind of surprising. What I expected were, articles about poverty and unemployment and race and inequality and maybe guns, and what it was, the first few pages were full of things about hostility toward Christians. The very first site that came up on Google was belief.net, asking, is there persecution against Christians today? The next, from the Christian Post, asked if America was headed toward a civil war. The most alarming was from something called the World Tribune, a man named Joe Schaefer. This was posted on May 31st of this year. Spiritual hostility fuels the darkness our elites are imposing on America. And then he said, in the name of health, Americans have been locked down and masked like dumb animals at the same time that corporate media behemoths and shameless politicians fuel racial and other societal divisions to the boiling point. Schaefer said that we must have positive shared values as a country, but he never said what those are. Further, he says, medical experts who have pushed coronavirus hysteria are tied to the hip to the forces of the New World Order globalism and the key culture of death agendas of population control. New World Order globalism? Culture of death and population control? Now, before I say anything about this inane assertion, I'm very disappointed about Google. And somebody who's out there who's a real tech person can help me with this, because I've experienced many times when I Google something and what comes up is one side of it, usually very conservative side. If you ever go and Google anything on the Bible, I never find anything of merit until I at least get to page 3. And I'm concerned about that. So I'm waiting for you tech people to tell me what's going on here. The remainder of this article includes a claim that many prominent Americans are dabbling in occult symbolism, including Melinda Gates and Chelsea Clinton. I agree with this Joe Schaefer on 2 points. There is hostility in America, and it is spiritual in nature. There are many good things going on in our country even now and in our communities. People do care for each other. They take care of each other. They deliver food to each other. We're taking care of the needs of the elderly and isolated. We contact each other. All these things need to be remembered. I was very moved by the moms in Portland. Everybody remember the moms in Portland? And also the vets who protected the moms in Portland. That said, I don't think anyone can deny the rise of hostility in our country today. But it isn't against white suburban Christians. And the irony of those articles that I read on the internet about hostility towards Christians was that the tone and content of the articles was hostile. Those who wrote those articles would point to the riot in our cities, Portland, for example, as the leading edge of hostility in America. The violence in the protests is wrong, but most of the people protesting were peaceful, and their purpose was to be nonviolent, making the violence regrettable. It is another irony that they who were protesting where there was some violence were protesting a hostility that's been a part of America since its inception, now being manifest in the killing of black Americans. Then the president sent out federal troops, and we have to ask, where's the hostility? It's no secret that Donald Trump is a man full of hostility. Just go follow his tweets. Lying is a form of hostility. Incivility is a form of hostility. Name-calling is hostile. Putting children of immigrants in cages is surely hostile. I would also like to include guns as hostile. If you ever wonder why there are more guns in America than in Canada, it's because we have more hostility in America. Scholar Miroslav Volf of Yale Divinity School says that the meta-experience of America today is a fortress mentality and self-defense. Most people are driven by defending themselves. We want to build a fortress or a wall around us to protect ourselves. There is a place always for self-defense in any culture, but when it becomes the most important facet of your culture, that's hostility. The picture I want to give you for this is, remember the couple in St. Louis who were standing outside of their home while peaceful protesters walked by, and the woman had a pistol and the man had an AR-15 as pointed at people as they walked by? Meta in Greek literally means after or beyond, but for Volf it means something like comprehensive, all-inclusive, and entire. So the meta experience of a culture is that which is comprehensive and entire. The gospel, the story of the feeding of the 5,000, is a meta experience for Christians. This also is a parable that is, if you go back to last week, it is generative and not definitive. It isn't meant to define just what happened, but to generate our faith. If you think of Jesus creating massive amounts of food from 5 loaves and 2 fish is quite stimulating, but it doesn't have legs. It makes Jesus out to be primarily a miracle worker, and all other meaning of the parable is dismissed. This story is far more profound as a picture of what the kingdom of God looks like, encouraging us to participate in it, making that the comprehensive, all-inclusive experience of our lives. We know that this picture is foundational for Christians, first because it relates to the Old Testament. In Exodus 16, to the bread from heaven, the manna in the wilderness, from 1 Kings, when Elijah feeds the widow, a little bit of grain and oil becomes an unending supply, and in 2 Kings, Elisha feeds 100 men. It's also important because it's told many times. It's in every one of the Gospels. And in addition to that, we have the story of the feeding of the 4,000. This means this is something important to the early Christians. Scholar John Dominic Crossan uses the words open commensality to describe what is happening at the feeding of the 5,000. Commensality means sharing one table together. It implies being at the same table in the same space, sharing everything equally. Crossan describes what the conditions of life were at the time of Jesus in Palestine. Peasants were at subsistence levels, living between poverty and destitution, debt, malnutrition, sickness, agrarian oppression. The common response to any of these situations is to take care of yourself and your own. You compete with each other for what little there is. You live in fear and suspicion. You build a fortress. Crossan believes Jesus was a disciple of John the Baptist, who held an apocalyptic view of the kingdom of God, that the end would come soon and God would make everything right. After John was killed, right before the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew, Jesus changes his understanding of the kingdom, not to something that we wait for, but for something that is already present. It says in Matthew, the kingdom of heaven has been brought near. John fasted in preparation for the time to come while Jesus feasted and celebrated for what is already here. As God is present and God's presence ought to create in us this meta experience, giving us a sense of living in the present. That experience is best imagined by sharing food, which eventually was turned into the celebration of communion. If people are living in scarcity, Crossan says, and if they have a fortress mentality, it is easy to imagine that they will always be holding back what they have, not sharing anything, and the miracle could be the change of heart which allowed them to share and to let go so that everybody would be fed. Crossan describes this meta-experience thusly. It is the ecstatic vision and social program sought to rebuild society upwards from its grassroots on principles of religious and economic egalitarianism, with free healing and free sharing of whatever they had, the deliberate conjunction of magic and meal, miracle and table, free compassion and open commensality was a challenge launched not just on the level of Judaism's strictest purity regulations, or even on that of the Mediterranean's patriarchal combination of honor and shame, patronage and clientage, but at the most basic level of civilization's eternal inclination to draw lines, invoke boundaries, establish hierarchies, and maintain discriminations. So the meta-experience of the feeding of the 5,000 was against this need to create lines and boundaries and walls and hierarchies and discriminations. And that is exactly what I saw in those articles that I spoke of earlier. Two events have really annoyed me I think it was this past week, and maybe a week before that have been in the news. One is the story of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who was accosted on the Capitol steps by a fellow representative from Florida, Ted Lolo. It bothered me for the nastiness of the attack, but for me, it was also the reason for it. He was angry because she suggested that the reason for the increase of violence in cities is poverty. I don't understand the alarm. Of course violence increases with poverty and unemployment. That's a given. You consider the destitution of people surrounding Jesus. It was not their temptation to violence. Isn't there a temptation to violence when you're destitute? When you don't have so much and you're fearful that everything you have may be taken from you? Of course you fight back. I see the difference here between someone who has seen poverty in Ocasio-Cortez and someone who doesn't understand it at all. Representative Yolo's interests, I believe, were in maintaining hierarchies, boundaries, and walls, and that is hostility. The other incident also involves a member of Congress, that would be Senator Tom Cotton, who says that the Founding Fathers viewed slavery as a necessary evil, to which I immediately ask, necessary for whom and evil for whom? Mr. Cotton is also trying to cut back funding on what is called the 1619 Project, meant to re-examine the legacy of slavery in America. He also is about boundaries, hierarchies, walls, and discriminations. And it is hostile. Hostility in America isn't just anywhere where you see incidents of violence. It is held deep in people's hearts about what meta experience one chooses to live by. Is that meta-experience walls, boundaries, hierarchies, and discriminations? Or is it an open commensality, egalitarianism, compassion, and a shared table? This makes it, as Joe Schaefer said, a spiritual matter. It is a matter of the heart. Schaefer says, no person of goodwill can deny that America in 2020 has become engulfed in a sinister darkness. Agreed, there is a darkness. But it's not manifest in what kind of jewelry Melinda Gates is wearing, or that the baker is not going to give a wedding cake to somebody who's LGBTQ. It rather is manifest in the baker's refusal to bake a cake for somebody who is LGBTQ and thus deny them a seat at the table. And what are the positive shared values that Schaefer did not mention that should define who we are? I recall some time ago a news story in which a representative from evangelical Christianity was asked, what are the social values that are most important for evangelicals? And he defined 3. Criminalization of abortion, denying LGBTQ people equal access, and religious freedom. Those 3. Are these what define who we are as a nation? In the Facebook post I shared about in the Cedar Crossings, the man mentions as values, he doesn't call them values, but they come out as values, are peace, family, America, salvation through Jesus Christ, protecting the unborn, supporting the military, helping neighbors, and praying for our leaders. Behind each one of those, if you look close, there's a wall and a line that's being drawn. Peace as calm doesn't include justice. And for Jesus, it was always peace with justice. Families that he is talking about will never include LGBTQ families. When he talks about America, he's talking about America first and drawing a line between America and everyone else. When he says salvation through Christ, he's talking about that as the only way, and again, drawing a boundary with everybody else. Abortion, the only perfect children in the world are the unborn, but once they are born, they're responsible for themselves. Supporting the military and denying the poor, helping neighbors who are actual neighbors, but not the neighbors who are on the other side of the world that Jesus would speak of. Praying for our leaders, but only if they're ours. Walls, boundaries, hierarchies, and discriminations. The value I see in this meta-experience that we have exhibited in the feeding of the 5,000 is open commensality, egalitarian provision of all God's creatures. In other words, everyone eats cake.